Our building is important to every single United States citizen. In Auburn, there were no less than a dozen automobile manufacturers. We have the earliest known Auburn in existence. If you can't be the biggest, it pays to be different. Cord set up his life here in Auburn. Also, the Duisenbergs are going into receivership. So along comes E.L. Cord. And he knows the Duisenbergs. He knows them by name. He knows their racing history. And in Cord's mind, he sees, what if we put, just like if we put front-wheel drive on a passenger vehicle, what if we put a racing engine in a passenger vehicle? What would that look like? The Model J wasn't built for the 1%. It was built for the 0.1%. So we can see that with the kings and queens and Maharaja and princes and princesses, government officials, obviously movie stars and Hollywood elite. That's a problem during the Great Depression.
And the two cars of which Frank Lloyd Wright had, one wrecked a couple of times, one not, and you have the clean Carfax one.
We've already been to Amelia this year, Concord in South Bend next weekend, Massachusetts, Hilton Head, Greenwich, Cincinnati, Concord, Michigan for the Automotive Hall of Fame.
Jeff Stearns, connected through cars. If they're bigwigs, we'll have them on the show. And yes, we'll talk about cars and everything else. Here he is now, Jeff Stearns.
Jeff Stearns, connected through cars with my new friend, Brandon Anderson. We met through a number of contacts, and you're the CEO, right, Brandon?
Yep, that's correct.
Of the Auburn Cord Duisenberg Automobile Museum in Auburn, Indiana. And we're not going to go into why it's in Auburn. If you don't know, then you probably shouldn't be watching this. But I'd really like you to open with, if you don't mind, Brandon, telling us about the museum.
Sure. Would love to tell you about the museum. And Jeff, I just want to say thanks for inviting me onto your show and being able to talk about the museum and some really interesting aspects of our history. So our museum opened July 6th of 1974. We, as the Auburn Cord Duisenberg Automobile Museum, acquired the original international headquarters in 1973 and restored it to be a museum and opened again in 1974. When we opened up, we actually originally didn't own any cars. The major thing that we wanted to do as an organization was to save the original building that was built for the Auburn Automobile Company that housed Cords and the administration for Duisenberg Inc., save it and make it a public asset as a museum. So when we opened, we had about 24 cars on loan to us in the restored Art Deco showroom. That's about 12,000 square feet of Art Deco splendor. Now, through time, we've expanded and we've opened up the entire building. It's over 100,000 square feet. The museum owns 119 vehicles. We also own 2 Stinson airplanes, and we are open 362 days a year to the public. And in a normal year, such as 2019, we see over 45,000 visitors a year from all over the world. What's real interesting is that Auburn Automobile Company and Duisenberg Inc. had dealerships in 89 different countries.
That's very interesting. I don't think everyone would know that about the international distribution. And also, you look really young. You weren't actually there for the opening in 74, were you?
No, I wasn't even born then. Give that about 12 more years for me. But I always say we as being part of the museum. If you,
of course,
you'll realize how passionate I am about the museum, and it's just kind of at my core. The museum, the building itself, is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. In 2005, we were designated a National Historic Landmark, which means the Secretary of the Interior and the National Park Service, they have found that our building is important to every single United States citizen and part of the American story and American history. So we are one of under 50 National Historic Landmarks in Indiana.
That's very interesting on its own.
Yeah, and I'd like to share that we're a multidisciplinary museum. Because we're in the original headquarters, when you come and visit, you are stepping into history. We don't recreate it. So you're seeing the original marketing offices where the artistic designs were done, the clay modeling studio where Alan Leamy's office was, and he, worked on his vehicles, and Gordon Burig and E.O. Cord's office, and the boardroom and the showroom. You are literally stepping into history, and just to kind of complement the experience, we have 1930s music playing throughout the museum as well.
And what does multidisciplinary mean? Forgive me. I mean, if this was a doctor's office, that might make more sense to me.
So museums will define themselves by, let's say they're an art museum, a history museum, even a zoo or an aquarium. For us, we're not just an automobile museum. We're an art museum, we're a history museum, we're a science museum, we're a technology museum, because it's within our storied walls of that National Historic Landmark building where all these innovations came about and where these individuals worked and really set the automotive world on fire and set trends and did first-time innovations and designs that really, some of them, including, say, front-wheel drive with the Cord L29, really didn't make another appearance for another 30-something years, but it was the Cord L29 that was the first American mass-produced vehicle that was available to the public to have front-wheel drive. So if you want to come and admire our automobiles, they are also works of art. Gordon Burig called them rolling sculpture. We actually have an art center inside the museum that you can see artistic displays of all the drawings that were done, concept designs for hubcaps, for gauges, again, the clay modeling studio. You'll learn about the history and the engineering. So there's really something for everybody at our museum.
Gosh, that sounds fabulous. I want to visit.
Well, you need to visit after this.
Yes, for sure. So you're in Auburn. So, I mean, that makes all the sense in the world. One of the car lines is Auburn.
Yep. So we're located in Auburn, Indiana, northeast Indiana. We're about 12 miles north of Fort Wayne. It's a small town. We have under 15,000 residents. And when the Auburn Automobile Company was here, and even at its height, there were about 5,000 residents in our city. So beautiful, small Midwest town. High quality of life, great things to do, wonderful downtown, historic architecture all over. It's really an amazing city. And some people might wonder, well, why Auburn? How did that happen? And it all started with the Eckhart family here in Auburn that started building carriages, and Mr. Eckhart. And like many companies, when the automobile became more prevalent or seen that was going to be the trend for the future, a lot of these carriage manufacturers tried their hand at creating automobiles, and that includes just strapping an engine onto a carriage. That happened here in Auburn. In Auburn, there were no less than a dozen automobile manufacturers, if you can believe it or not, in our small town.
No, and I'm from Detroit, so I'm imagining, this is the epicenter, and if there's going to be a dozen manufacturers anywhere, I would never imagine that part of Indiana, no.
Well, we have an Indiana gallery that there's a big blown-up map of Indiana, and it highlights all the cars produced in Indiana, even some that didn't make to full production, say maybe 3 were made. But Indiana is just right underneath Michigan, both literally and figuratively, in vehicle production. So Indiana has a great storied history with automobiles. So the Eckharts continued to build those carriages and continued to think about the automobile. And then when Mr. Eckhart passed away, Charles Eckhart, his sons, Frank and Morris, they took up the company and they created the Auburn Automobile Company in 1900. Their first vehicle was created in 1903. We have the earliest known Auburn in existence from 1904, and they continued with that company until they were wonderful at what they were doing and creating the cars. However, they weren't the business people that was really needed to compete with all the other vehicle manufacturers. And that's when you get into the story of what happened in the mid-1920s when the Auburn Automobile Company went into receivership and was purchased by a group of investors from Chicago, which was nicknamed the Chicago Gang. In the mid to late 1800s, Charles Eckhart, he started a wagon manufacturing company, and they were excellent wagon manufacturers, and they did see, him and his sons saw towards the end of the 1800s that many people were going towards the automobile. And like many carriage manufacturers at the time, another great example from Indiana's Studebaker, they transitioned from making carriages to making automobiles and rudimentary machines, taking a carriage and literally strapping an engine onto it. They also, some of them like Zimmerman, for example, also putting engines onto these carriages. Well, they continued manufacturing, and then unfortunately, Mr. Charles Eckhart passed away, and the business was taken over by his sons, Frank and Morris. Now, taking the lead of the automobile production, they actually in 1900 started the Auburn Automobile Company. First vehicle was created and sold in 1903. However, the earliest known Auburn still in existence is from 1904. It's a beautiful, beautiful vehicle. And you look at the reviews of those cars at the time and some of, the sales literature, they were making a very quality car. But the brothers were not businessmen. They did a very good job producing those cars. And like a lot of these early vehicle manufacturers, it takes the businessman to be able to get them to be successful, especially when you're competing with larger companies that are able to get their material at a cheaper price because they're buying such quantities. So in the early 1920s, the brothers, they went into receivership with the Auburn Automobile Company, and it was purchased by a group of investors from Chicago. And one of them was William Wrigley Jr., of chewing gum fame. And they wanted to turn this company around. Well, they were businessmen. However, they were not automobile salesmen. They were not automobile designers. That was not their specialty. So they really wanted to bring somebody on board that would turn this company around and actually make it profitable and hopefully, have future success with the company. And that's where we get into the story of Eric Loban Cord, or as he went by, E.L. Cord. And he was brought on to the Auburn Automobile Company by the Chicago investors in 1924. And when he was brought on at that time, he was selling Moon automobiles in Chicago. And interestingly enough, now Cord was a businessman and he was a salesman. The Moon automobiles that E.L. Cord was selling from that Chicago dealership made up 60% of all national sales of Moons. So he was very successful and he was very well known and also quite young. So he was brought onto the company, and originally the idea was that the investors would offer him a certain salary and he would be general manager. And Cord said, well, how about this? I take a lower salary that would equal either 20% of net sales or a certain flat amount per year, whichever one is greater, but I want to have stock options and to be able to acquire stocks. Well, that was the first move of Cord becoming the Titan of transportation. And eventually, by 1926, Cord owned the majority of the stocks in the Auburn Automobile Company, that he named himself president, and he became one of the sole owners of the Auburn Automobile Company. Now, what did Cord do to make this so successful? Cord came in and he saw in Auburn the vehicles that the Auburn Automobile Company had produced that weren't selling, that were basically sitting in the back lot. And he thought, what are we going to do to sell these? So he did a paint program where he painted them, or had the company paint them in very flashy, bright colors and do different color trim work and actually have lines on the vehicles. And they sold like crazy. So this back 1924 stock that's refreshed for 1925 model year, this is what saved the company. So Cord continued on that line, and actually it speaks to one of Cord's quotes that I find very interesting. And he said, "If you can't be the biggest, it pays to be different." So he made the Auburn Automobile Company different and saved that company. So Cord was a serial entrepreneur. He actually started as a teenager. He would buy a Model T for, say, $250. He would strip the body off of it. he would put a more streamlined, sporty body on it, kind of like a coupe or what we would think of a boat tail speedster. And then he would sell it for multiple times that original investment. He ended up doing that enough that after about a year or two, he acquired $10,000 just by doing those vehicles.
In that era, I mean, that's massive.
Yeah. And so that allowed him to kind of move around a little bit and start his life, marry his first wife, and then have a couple of children as well. And then they're going to Chicago for Moon Automobiles, and then moving on to Auburn for the Auburn Automobile Company. So Cord set up his life here in Auburn. He and his wife, they built a house here. It's funny, the museum is located at 1600 South Wayne Street, and his home here in Auburn is located at 1600 North Main Street. His home still stands. So Cord created a life here, and he really charged the Auburn Automobile Company. And we think about the boat tail speedsters. It was under Cord's leadership and the hiring of these younger designers, including Alan Leamy and Gordon Burig, that he really allowed them to express their passion, their interest, and their design capabilities and create some of these very different vehicles. So it was under Cord that these iconic vehicles like Auburn boat tail speedsters, we'll get into the Cord 810 and 812, the Cord L29, the Duisenberg Model J. Without E.L. Cord, these things would have never happened. I can't say 100% for sure, but it wouldn't look like what we know as that automotive history and that legacy of those full classics. So Cord, he also decided to build his own vehicle line, and he was very interested in racing from a young age, always interested in it, kind of was an amateur racer himself. He was a little bit of a racer mechanic as well. We've got a couple of photos of him riding in the mechanic seat of some of these racing vehicles. And one of the things that he saw at the Indianapolis 500 was Harry Miller's design for front-wheel drive. And that inspired him to think, well, what if we put that into a passenger vehicle and sold that to the public? It's not only safer, it's sportier. There are many accolades that go along with front-wheel drive. And so he actually hired Miller to work with him to create the front-wheel drive Cord L29. And as automotive historians know, the Cord L29 was the first produced vehicle in America available to the public that had front-wheel drive. And that is absolutely incredible. It was that foresight of Cord and working with Miller to bring that engineering and that technology to passenger vehicles and to create the L29.
Now, Brandon, forgive me, is this Cord yet the fastest production car? Because I always knew that Cord at one time had fastest car in America or the world.
They set land speed records with the Auburn boat tail speedster at the Salt Flats. That's kind of the Ab Jenkins that every plate on the speedster says, driven 100.6 miles per hour. So they set speed records, but that's over a period of time. So I don't know if it was the fastest, but they set the records for, the average speed.
Got it. Okay.
So there were famous owners of L29s as well. One of my favorites being Frank Lloyd Wright. He had two L29s, and the museum owns one of them. And he expressed his passion for the L29 in a publication that was put out by Cord that was called What Owners Are Saying. And in his quotes, paraphrasing here, Wright is noted as saying that the expression and lines of the Cord come closer to marvels of engineering more than anything I've ever seen. He loved his Cord, and that's why he had two of them. His first one was actually in two separate accidents. So later in life, he ended up acquiring a second one, and that's the one that we own. So if you look at the advertisements of the time period, too, with the L29, you see, again, promoting the safety, promoting the sleekness. Because of the front-wheel drive, the car is actually able to be lower as well. So it was lower than any other vehicles being produced at that time. So you've got that attractiveness And just that design, you can't mistake an L29 and the different body styles that are there. And of course, they did with their advertising photo shoots with famous people who own those vehicles. So then we go on from the L29 and what Cord did with Duesenberg. So many of us know Fred and Augie Duisenberg, and we know that they started out as bicycle racers, immigrating here to America, and then they got into vehicle racing. And if you look, for example, at the Indianapolis 500 or what became Le Mans, and you see the Duesenberg name, that time it was not a Duesenberg vehicle, it was a Duesenberg engine. So the Duesenbergs were notorious for their racing engines and that prowess that they had for that. Similarly, the Duesenbergs were not businessmen. They were fantastic designers of their engines. They were known for their racing. They obviously had a name for themselves. But when they created the first passenger vehicle with the Duesenberg name on it, which at the time was called the Straight 8, what we now know is the Model A. The first one was created and delivered to its owner, Samuel Northrop Castle, in 1921. That vehicle is also in the collection of the museum. It was donated to us in 2019 by the Castle family. They have owned that vehicle, or they had owned that vehicle for 99 years, and then donated it to the Auburn Duisenberg Automobile Museum to share it with the public and preserve the history of Duisenberg and the Castle family. So the Duisenberg brothers had a certain number that they wanted to meet, say 600 straight 8s a year. Well, from 1921 really to 1926, that's about how many that they made. So they obviously did not make the mark on what they were trying to sell. It was a very expensive vehicle for the time period. They were hand built. They had those Duesenberg engines. Fred Duesenberg kept working on the engines and tinkering and making them better, but that caused significant delays. Like the Castle Duesenberg was ordered in 1919. Mr. Castle didn't get it until 1921 because they were redoing the engine, or the retooling and coming up with the Straight 8. Originally, it wasn't going to be a Straight 8. So at this time, also the Duesenbergs are going into receivership. So along comes E.L. Cord, and he knows the Duesenbergs. He knows them by name. He knows their racing history. And in Cord's mind, he sees, what if we put, just like if we put front-wheel drive on a passenger vehicle, what if we put a racing engine in a passenger vehicle? What would that look like? So he acquires Duisenberg Automobile and Motors Company, and at that time they were in Indianapolis. He renames it Duisenberg Inc. He hires both Fred and Augie, and at that time they had been producing a couple of prototype vehicles that are known as Model X's. There were several chassis made and bodies made, and again, they were experimenting with the engines and different designs. To this day, there are only 4 extant Model X's in the world. One of them is a boat tail speedster. 2 of them are dual cowl Phaetons, and another one is an enclosed sedan. The museum actually owns half of the X's in the world. We own the X boat tail speedster, and we also own one of the dual cowl Phaetons. We right now have 3 on display. One of them is owned by one of our board members. And do you know who owns the 4th one?
No.
Of course, it's Jay Leno.
Oh, of course. Okay. If you force me to guess at gunpoint, who else? Right.
So at this time, they're working on the X's, and E.L. Cord, when he acquires the company, says, we're going to stop working on these vehicles. I am charging you with creating the fastest and most luxurious automobile available to the public, and that's what I want you to work on. And what did they come out with? It's what we know as the Model J. So is under Cord's leadership that he charged the Duesenberg brothers, and even having Gordon Burig design the Duesenberg from the cowl forward. And what's interesting, there was another prototype called a Model Y, and it's the precursor to the J. It's in between the X and the J. There were only a few built. They were all to be destroyed. However, one of the Duesenbergs didn't destroy one of the chassis body, And now there is actually one Model Y in the world that's privately owned. However, it is on loan to the museum, and you can see it when you come and visit. But when you look at that Y, you can also see the development and really what was forming to become of the Model J in the body there. So the Model J was created, and then, of course, working with the different coach builders to put the body on it. But a Model J at the time period, you're paying $7,500, $8,500 just for the chassis and engine alone. And then you go on top of that, and then you have to go to the body manufacturers and coach builder and put a coach on it. I think the most expensive was between $20,000 and $22,000.
In what year?
That would be between 1929 and really 1936, 37.
Okay, so we're talking about $1 million equivalents.
Oh, plus, yeah, absolutely. You know, these, we kind of joke that the Model J wasn't built for the 1%. It was built for the 0.1%. So we can see that with the kings and queens and Maharaja and princes and princesses, government officials, obviously movie stars and Hollywood elite. These were the flashiest vehicles. Well, that's a problem during the Great Depression when people are standing in food lines. They don't know where money is coming from. They don't know how to feed their children. And the Model J is flying around. So that was one of the things that kind of hindered the company a bit from moving forward. Really, Auburn's, Cords, and Duisenbergs were all playing off of one another to support the company in all of its sales. Unfortunately, you know, after and during the Great Depression, by 1937, the losses at the company were significant, and the decision was made to close. And they closed everything. There were no pink slips. Literally, the doors were shut down, and people were out of work, and that's including, you know, down in Indianapolis, here in Auburn. Vehicle manufacturing also happened at the Central Manufacturing Plant in Connersville, Indiana. So it was a layoff of thousands of people. After that, Cord went on to different business ventures. It was during his time with the Auburn Automobile Company that he started the Cord Corporation. And the Cord Corporation was a holding company, a subsidiary for all of the different companies that Cord owned. So we have a list of over 60 companies. Actually, I have the list in front of me, but people will be amazed about what he owned. He owned American Airways, for example. It was under Cord's leadership that it was changed to American Airlines. He owned several, actually, different airline companies. He owned Stinson Airplanes, which is why we have two Stinsons. Actually, one of them is currently being restored. It was owned by the Auburn Automobile Company in 1930. And we have a photo when the building opened in 1930 and a Stinson right there in that corner. So we're replicating that history. He had central manufacturing, as I had mentioned, New York Shipbuilding Corporation. He went into real estate, television studios, radio stations. He went into uranium mining, then railroad transport. Then again, with the ships that he had, he went into Checker Cab Company and the Yellow Cab Company, Safety Cab Company, National Transportation Company. I mean, you kind of name it. And if it's in the transportation field, Cord was involved with it. So much so that when the Securities Exchange Commission was established in 1936, one of the first people that they were investigating was E.O. Cord and the Cord Corporation. So it was during that time that Cord did sell off his over 20% of the Cord Corporation at that time, walking away with about, I want to say it was about $2.5 million at that time. But he would continue, and he would move on to Beverly Hills, where he actually owned a plot of land, and he created a 56-room mansion that was called Cord Haven. And he had a cattle ranching industry and cattle ranching farm or ranch as well in Nevada that was called the Circle L Ranch. And he was a Nevada state senator. He went on to do amazing things. We have photos with him of JFK. Cord created this amazing legacy within the transportation world. So we're looking again at Auburn's, Cord's, Duisenbergs. Our physical museum building that we're in wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Cord. He's the one that hired the architect from Fort Wayne to design it, and he's the one who built it, and it was opened up in 1930. We could possibly not have the Cord 810 and 812 that I haven't even gone into, but the hidden headlights on there that were designed, and the coffin nose grill that you have there, and the louvers, and the fuel filler cap, and the Bendix transmission that's on that, the semi-automatic transmission. There were so many things that Cord created, or that people that worked for Cord created, and he charged his employees hard. I mean, he made them work hard and do more with less. It was very lean all the time. Even, for example, you're creating the grandest Duesenberg Model J, and then he says, we need a radiator cap for that shows that it's a Model J, but you don't have any money to design it, and you basically have to do it with parts that we have. And that's exactly what they did. You can tell an original Duesenberg J cap because you can actually see the seams where it's welded the Duesenberg onto the little holder. So again, without Cord, I really think that the transportation world would look so different. God knows you and I wouldn't be sitting here and talking. We wouldn't have the Auburn Cord Duisenberg Automobile Museum. We wouldn't have the Auburn Cord Duisenberg Club. We wouldn't have the Auburn Cord Duisenberg Festival. I mean, it's almost like collateral damage when you think, what would happen if E.O. Cord wasn't here?
Well, what a legacy, for sure.
An extreme legacy, both of his, and we obviously give great respect and commend the people that work with Cord too. There are lots of people, thousands of people behind the scenes that work to make this all happen. However, we're looking at the leadership of Cord and what he did.
Unbelievable. And not bad for your first day. What can I tell you?
Yeah.
Amazing. You did really well studying. So tell us a little bit about the E.L. Cord Gallery.
Yes. So, with the stories I'm telling you and all this history that's there, we talk about Cord and the Cord Corporation a bit, but we've never talked about the entire story and put it into an exhibit from beginning to end to understand Cord and the Cord Corporation. So we are the storytellers, and we are the keepers of that history, and who else is best poised to tell that story? And we're also very fortunate that we have a lot of E.O. Cord's personal items and a lot of his business items. We have the largest Cord collection that's out there, except for maybe some of the family members that still have pieces from Mr. Cord and the family. So we decided that we are going to create a whole new gallery at the museum. We are in the final stages of design for that. We received a matching grant from the state of Indiana, the Indiana Destination Development Corporation. We won first place out of 40 applicants and down to 4 finalists for $250,000 to be able to tell this story. We are going to bring people to Auburn, Northeast Indiana, and Indiana to learn more about Cord, and the gallery is going to be named the E.L. Cord Gallery of Entrepreneurship. And as I had mentioned, Cord was a serial entrepreneur from beginning to end. And in this story that we're going to weave and tell and talk about Mr. Cord and the Cord Corporation and other people like Lucius Manning and Harold Ames, for example, we're going to show through artifacts, images, graphics, home movies, scrapbooks, etc., the story of Cord. We have even one of his suits that we're going to put on display, a formal suit. Then we have, I mentioned Circle L Ranch. We have his cattle ranching, basically, outfit. We're going to have that on display. We have digitized the home movies of Cord. So we'll have that on a projector that shows on the wall. And we're going to take the scrapbook from the family and digitize that, and you'll be able to digitally flip through that. So the new gallery hopefully will open towards the first quarter of next year. Hopefully people can come out and see that. It's going to be really exciting to be able to share this full story with the public. And in that gallery, too, we're going to focus on different types of entrepreneurs and modern entrepreneurs in Northeast Indiana. And our hope is that both adults and children will be able to see themselves in those entrepreneurs and possibly become one themselves and get inspired through different industries and backgrounds, and really show what you can do if you put your mind to it and if you don't give up.
That sounds fabulous, and congratulations on winning the $250,000 to get that going.
And what's really cool about this job too, and for people who love the hobby and automobiles, etc. First of all, the fact that I have a great perk of the job and that I'm able to drive the vehicles. That's a huge thing on its own, to be able to drive these Auburns, Cords, Duisenbergs, Packard. We own 119 different vehicles. So whenever we get a car running, I drive it. Hopefully in time, I'll drive every car that we own. And each car has its own difference and nuance. Learning how to drive an 810, 812 was a lot of fun. And L29 is a lot of fun to drive. I think they're fantastic. They're also very different. But let's say for Cars and Coffee, which we do every third Saturday of the month, I'll drive, let's say, my 2020 Mini Cooper to work, or my 2001 Audi. And then I will bring out a 31 Auburn. I'll bring out like a 30, maybe let's say a 31 Duisenberg Model J, a 1963 Corvette. See, we did, and then maybe like a 36 Cord 810 or 812. And I'm like, at the end of the day, just kind of reflecting and thinking, I just kind of drove automotive history, all the way from the 20s, really, through 2020. That's 100 years of automotive history. It's just really interesting to think about. So it's obviously very awesome, and we get to travel the country too. We take our vehicles across the country to concours. So we've already been to Amelia this year.
Too bad we didn't meet at Amelia.
Yeah, it was great. We brought our 1948 Tasco. That was a Gordon Burig prototype. Won the Chairman's Award for that from Bill Warner, given to us by Lynn St. James. We're going to Concours in South Bend actually next weekend. We'll be in Massachusetts. We'll be in Hilton Head. We'll be in, Hilton Head, Greenwich. We were at the Cincinnati Concours. Oh, and then we'll be up in Michigan for the Automotive Hall of Fame, their induction ceremony that Jay Leno is going to be inducted. And the historical inductees, why the museum is going to, two of them are E.L. Cord and then Duisenberg. So we're bringing a Duisenberg to that, to a Model J that we'll have on display.
I'm a little jealous.
I know a lot of people are like, how did you get your job? I want your job. Well,
that on top of making $750,000 a year. I mean, what else could you ask for?
Yeah. All that nonprofit money. Yeah.
Well, I cannot tell you, Brandon, how much I appreciate you coming on and sharing with us, because the people watching the show are very often car enthusiasts. Not everyone that we have on is a car. I mean, they're all car lovers and met through the car business. But I mean, the majority of our audience, I think, is going to just eat this stuff up. And you told us so well, down to the details and the dates and the names of the people, and had the car 99 year. And the two cars of which Frank Lloyd Wright had, one wrecked a couple of times, one not. And you have the clean Carfax one. So, Brandon, thank you very much. I really appreciate you joining the show. I know our guests are going to have a great time watching this.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Jeff, for inviting me to be a part of the show and sharing a little bit of the history of the Auburn Cord Duisenberg Automobile Museum.
And I mean, look, can we get a 10% discount for mentioning the show? What do they have to do to get in?
Just let them know Brandon sent you. We'll probably charge you more.
This has been Jeff Stearns, Connected Through Cars.